Hello and good morning to all of you. Welcome back to our last day of the conference, day 4 of the conference. I hope you're all well and healthy, relaxed, and had some time to rest after this long day, at least from our perspective, long day yesterday, where we had a lot of program items and a lot of fruitful discussions. Here in Cologne, the weather is back to something that is pretty normal for this time of the year. We have rain. We have this morning 6 degrees. So after 3 days of sun, we're back to normal, and the water is secure. It's coming like from the sky. And I'm very happy to have you all here. We have today a very interesting program again. We'll start off with a nice keynote speech, then again have also sessions, parallel sessions before we move into the overall wrap-up of the conference. And I think you shouldn't miss that, because we will have, again, interesting people on stage, and we will also give you the chance to tell us a bit about how you experienced the conference, and that, of course, will be very, very interesting. And I see already in the chat some people greeting us. Good morning. Yes, good morning to you. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Very happy to have you back here for the last day of the conference. And with this, I would like to get started. I would like to invite someone who has, I would say, seen a lot with regards to what's happening in the water community. And here he is already coming up on the screen. We can see him in a moment, I'm sure. It is Nicholas Schofield, who is joining us from Australia. There he is. Nick, can you hear me? You need to activate your microphone still.
It should be activated.
Now I can hear you.
Excellent.
Excellent. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm very well, thank you, and enjoying a nice 27-degree day here in Canberra.
Oh, wow. That's a contrast. Thank you for that. But for you, it's already in the evening hours, right? It's like, what is it, 6 o'clock in the evening?
It's 6:18 in the evening, yes.
6:18, all right.
It's still light, yeah.
All right. Very good to have you, Nick. Let me say a few words before we get to your presentation. So Nick is the director of the Global Future Research and also a professional fellow at the University of New South Wales. And in his career, he has done many different things. I can't list them all. He has led research programs in Australia on different water-related topics. He founded actually the Global Water Institute, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of New South Wales. And he also worked, besides his work in Australia, he worked a lot internationally on climate change issues, water security, of course, like river basin management and irrigation and cities and many different issues. He was, until he retired from that position last year, the CEO of the Australian Water Partnership, which is I would say, a high-profile initiative by the Australian government. He was their CEO for 3 years, was in charge of overall, of course, programming and management of the AEWP. And what I saw, Nick, which is pretty remarkable when I looked at your bio, is that you really worked across the board. You worked in research, you worked in the industry, private sector. You also were involved in policy in Australia, but also in a way internationally. So you worked nationally and internationally. And one thing that struck me is that you have a PhD in astrophysics. So
right, yes.
Is it like that you started by looking at the stars first, and then you thought, okay, I come back down to Earth and look at real world problems on our planet?
That's exactly right, Michael. And, my PhD was on the origin of the solar system and the planets and the Earth. And it's a nice perspective to always keep in mind when you are down to Earth.
All right, that's great. Okay, Nick, then I would give you the floor. I would give you the screens, we say, I guess, in this age. And you will give us a keynote on climate change and water security across the Asia Pacific, from local to regional perspective. And we can see the presentation already up on the screen, and we're very much looking forward to it. Please, Nick, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I should firstly say I'm absolutely delighted to be invited to give this fourth keynote and the final one for this conference. And I'd like to acknowledge, of course, our colleagues and sponsors in Germany, but also the Vietnamese Academy for Water Resources for hosting this conference. I should say, in my role with the Australian Water Partnership, we did run some and are still running some very fruitful collaborations in Vietnam around water utilities, irrigation efficiency, and through what's called the Australian Mekong Water Facility. But today, as Michael said, I'm going to talk about climate change and water security across the Asia-Pacific in particular, and from local to regional scales. And so in that process, I want to start off with a recent assessment of the status of water security in the region, and then talk about a review that a colleague and I have been undertaking. What have been the responses, particularly the policy responses, and specifically some of the gaps that we've identified in those responses. And I want to spend probably most of today, being towards the end of the conference, on discussing some ideas on the way forward, some new ways of thinking. So firstly, starting with the question of what is the water security across the Asia Pacific, and fortunately, just released in December 2020 was the Asia Water Development Outlook, a product of the ADB, to which the Australian Water Partnership was a significant partner. And you can see in this figure that water security has been rated across 5 levels, from nascent, which means starting to think about, through to the next step of being engaged in the issue, to the third step of developing some serious capability in policy initiatives and in tools, through to the 4th level of applying those capabilities effectively, and to the 5th being a model country, and that everybody can look to, but unfortunately there's no model countries that come out of this analysis. But I should say in terms of trends, because this is the 3rd detailed outlook, the first one in 2013, second one 2016, and the 3rd 2020. In terms of trends, there have been a significant improvement in the progression from nascent to engaged to capable to effective in that time. But interesting, most of that improvement was happened, as you can see in those small figures in the top right there, between 2013 and 2016, and a smaller improvement over the last 4 years. Now, the outlook analyzes water security across 5 different dimensions, and I just want to focus on this one dimension in particular at this point, which is water-related disasters, which naturally include climate change. And if you look at the table at the bottom there, the results are quite interesting, because you can see many countries actually doing quite well out of a maximum score of 15, in their ability to manage and respond to water-related disasters. And indeed, there's a positive trend. And this surprised me a little in looking at the results, because we hear, the situation is worsening. But the positive trends in increasing capacity, decreasing vulnerability, and rapidly decreasing overall risk in East Asia. Other findings identifying that the greatest residual risk is still in the Pacific Island nations, of course, particularly exposed to climate change impacts. And the other key finding that hydrologic disasters, particularly floods, affected the most people in Asia from 2010 to 2019. Interesting set of findings there. But coming to how have countries responded to these issues, their policy responses, their strategy responses. And what this diagram shows, there's a lot of information here. They've responded in numerous ways and very impressive ways, addressing the key risks of drought, floods, saltwater intrusion, cyclones, water pollution, and so on, through a range of different approaches, from nationally based monitoring and warning systems to catchment management and water source conservation, through to integrated water supply management systems, and numerous others that I'll leave you time to read. But I want to focus on, having these responses being developed, what are some of the gaps in those responses? This has come out of our recent review and identified 6 what we call problems here. First problem is proliferating policies. So there's many policies being developed, but with huge implementation and compliance gaps. Related to that, the second problem is institutions that implement these policies frequently lack the technical, human, and financial resources to do so effectively. The third problem is all too often an overly technical focus on the solutions that lack social, ecological, and cultural considerations. The fourth one is an interesting one, and we've called it romanticizing of local action without sufficient attention given to supporting local groups and to multi-level governance. The fifth problem is an absence, largely at the regional scale, in considering socio-ecological zones where common solutions can be applied in different geographies. The sixth problem, as we mentioned previously in the conference, is that the rhetoric around integration and nexus is bold and innovative, but to date has had little real impact at the ground level. Moving on to some ideas about the way forward. The first that I'd like to approach is the use of the risk management of framework to manage risks. And of course, risk is a combination of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, or is often expressed that way. And the first thing I'd like to suggest is that hazards, climate change hazards, for example, cannot be reduced unless you actually reduce the root causes behind climate change and global warming. That means reducing greenhouse emissions, and I think that's critical to understand that. Exposure, on the other hand, has many options to reduce exposure to hazards. You see in the top right-hand corner picture, early warning systems in Nepal have been developed in response to the glacial outburst issues. Other interventions, such as protecting water quality at source, retreating from flood-prone areas, are ways of reducing exposure to a hazard. And vulnerability often focuses more on human situations, vulnerability, capability. And the first example here is to prioritize human water needs in droughts, and that's something Australia had to do in its millennium drought. And you can see in the picture in the bottom left of women in Chennai queuing up to get water as the day zero approached a couple of years ago. Cyclone proofing housing is another example on the bottom right there in the Philippines, which are subject to many cyclones. Just continuing a little bit on this risk management theme, I'd like to introduce you to some recent work where we've analysed the risk of COVID-19 across the Asia Pacific by combining the water security risk framework with the public health risk framework, shown in that box at the top there. I won't go through each aspect of that, but by applying that risk analysis, we've rated 48 countries across the Asia Pacific from low to extremely high risk of COVID-19 with respect to the water security lens. And the other important aspect of this tool I want to emphasize is that it allows you to identify critical interventions in each country that will reduce risk. And that's a very helpful starting point to know how to go forward with COVID-19 in the water sector. The second way forward here is coming back to the EDO 5 dimensions of water security. You can see there rural households, economic water security, urban water security, environmental and water-related disaster security, the 5 dimensions. And the proposal here is that each of those dimensions separately demand their own attention in designing interventions. So, for example, with say key dimension 2, economic water security, improving water productivity and increasing water use efficiency are 2 very well established interventions. If you go to key dimension 4, environmental water security, maintaining flow variability, we call environmental flows found to be critical for maintaining healthy aquatic ecosystems. Rising temperatures, managing thermal regimes is very important, and throughout Asia in particular, improving water quality is an enormous challenge and vital. Moving to the third way forward that I'm proposing here is to design interventions around socioecological zones. And the purpose of this is that a particular ecological zone will feature in many different geographies, so there can be some commonality to solutions in each zone. So I've identified here the Pacific zone, dry zones, large coastal cities, lower Himalayas, and delta regions. So for example, in the Pacific, it's well known there's a huge challenge in building capacity to manage water security risks, particularly under climate change, which is a huge threat to the Pacific. For deltas, we've heard in this conference the importance of integrating infrastructure with community voices for managing upstream flow and sediment issues and adjusting livelihoods under the influence of saltwater intrusion. Moving on to the fourth way forward, I wanted to share with you firstly this table produced by the OECD, which was the first time in the Asian Water Development Outlook that this piece of work has been done. And it's a very nice piece of work, I think, because it shows how each region across the Asia Pacific is progressing towards meeting the 12 OECD principles of water governance. If you take principle 1, roles and responsibilities, you can see all regions are doing well, which is important. You've got to get those right. If you come down to the bottom, say monitoring and evaluation, you see it's a much more mixed picture with a number of regions still in the early phases of that particular aspect of governance. Staying on this concept of governance, I've called this governments and governance interventions because one of the critical things we found in the review is the importance of understanding the interrelationships between local government, municipalities, provinces and states at a larger level, national level and regional level. You have all these different levels of interacting governance. And again, interventions can focus on a particular level, it's local, national or regional examples here, but it's the linking across those levels which is as critically important. So the local level here, we say strengthen connections to higher levels of government to expand on local innovations. Regional level, an example is enhancing cooperation and knowledge sharing mechanisms. One of the roundtables coordination was mentioned in that respect, including all stakeholders in decision making. I now move forward to my fifth and final suggested way forward, and this table is the full result from the EDO Analysis List of all the countries from the best performing, I guess, to the least performing. And as I said before, there was no model countries that, have got everything right. But there are a handful of countries, that have got to the stage of their, implementation of policies, strategies, and tools that are effective in dealing with water security and climate change. And there's the opportunity to emulate or learn from some of the successes there and from many other countries who perform well in particular aspects. And I'm pleased to say that all those countries in that category have very active programs for assisting other countries with these approaches. I've noted that a couple of my colleagues from Australia, Robin Johnson and John Dorr, haven't been able to connect at times on panels and represent some of the Australian experience. I wanted here to touch on Australia's experience because it is the driest inhabited continent. It's also known as the land of floods, droughts, and fire. And I want to emphasize that, the Australian story is an evolution. There's always new challenges. Every decade has brought new challenges and new responses have been required. And we've had some, pretty big hits. We had the huge millennium drought over 13 years from 1997 to 2009, Australia's worst ever, followed by our worst ever floods, 2010 and 11. And more recently, you're aware of the world's largest bushfires, 2019-20. And on the far right there, Perth, on the west of the country, is probably one of the cities most affected by climate change worldwide. So got a lot of experience to share, and just very quickly how that's evolved through decades in the bottom half of this slide. Interestingly, Australia finished its dam building and water storage, surface water storage program in the 1970s, and has done very little to add to that in terms of dam building since. The 1980s, it turned to demand management and water use efficiency in domestic and irrigation areas. The 1990s is a very big focus on environmental flows, fishways, and river health. In the 2000s, following the millennium drought, our water storages were exceeded in terms of their capacity to provide water. And most of Australia's major cities got very, very low in their water availability. And that spawned a large investment in large desalination plants for all our major coastal cities. But at the same time, in rural areas where irrigation was exposed to the drought, we developed some innovative cap and trade water markets that have protected both the productivity and the survival of the irrigation industry. In the 2010s, got serious about integrated river basin management with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And in the urban area, espoused a new concept we call water-sensitive cities. Which brings up 2020s, and the story never stops because, following these bushfires, which were horrendous, we now have denuded catchments with all sorts of sediment and other water contamination issues to manage. And the Perth story is very interesting that it's evolved. Its water supplies had to change dramatically over the last 50 years, from surface water to groundwater to desal, and most recently to wastewater treatment and recycling through managed aquifer recharge for potable use. That brings me to my last slide, which we call New Ways of Thinking, to, I guess, try and sum up some of the shifts that have occurred in recent years. And the first one I've called from climate change apathy to a growing recognition of the importance of climate change and water security as a critical nexus for how that plays out. From stationarity to embracing uncertain futures, from scientific solutions and something I've termed solution confusion, to demand-led co-production of solutions that are tailored to specific social, political, and cultural contexts, from endless risk assessments to risk assessments that lead to policy-relevant actionable knowledge, treatment of water as a single sector to water as a cross-sectoral system, focus on political boundaries to we'd like to see a focus on socio-ecological zones and transboundary systems, already topical. Infrastructure solutions, which we often go to being hard solutions to being more inclusive of nature-based solutions, and we've heard plenty of that in this conference. And one that will never go away, seemingly, is we all love to do projects, and we get funded projects for certain periods of time, but the fly-in, fly-out process of projects does not lead to system-wide innovation and long-term capacity development, unfortunately. Thank you very much. I was going to keep a record of my time, but hopefully I haven't gone too far over. Michael.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for the presentation. No, we're good with time. I think that's fine. And thank you so much for also bringing in some of the aspects that John Doe and Robin Johnston would have covered. That's very kind. So thank you for bringing in that perspective as well. I mean, you have covered like the whole thing. I believe you have given us a very good overview of what the situation is in the Asia Pacific, and I really liked also your slides on where you listed the problems, and the last one on new ways of thinking. And I have actually in the chat there is a question. Now let's just get started with a question from the chat. I believe the question from our colleague Trin in Vietnam, how the water. Sorry, now it's shifted. I have to look at the other screen. How the water and climate community contribute to the way forward discussion you mentioned. Maybe how should it contribute to that way forward discussion? What is your take on that, Nick?
I think those shift that I mentioned and the way forward approaches, emergent properties from the water and climate community broadly. And what we've done in our review of policies and gaps and contemplating different ways forward have come out of that assessment. So I think going forward, we would like to test some of these ideas. To be honest, these are early ideas. The review was large, deep and complex, and extracting good ways forward is an art form and ongoing. So these are early ideas we'd like to test, I think, on the community.
I think that's a good one. I mean, there's all these. I mean, we talked about a lot of the things that you have on the slide, on the last slide throughout the conference. I remember co-production. I remember making information more accessible and usable and actionable. So testing them, getting started, and learning and making experiences, I think, is the way forward. And you got a compliment. Someone says nice information. And then there is a question from Lars Ribbe. Thanks, Nick. Great presentation, and proud to have you at our conference. Question 1: could you explain the challenge of romanticizing local engagement? And second, isn't there an overlap of household urban economic dimensions of water security? UN 2013, I think he's quoting the report, just had 4 dimensions, question mark. I guess you can also read it.
Yes, thank you. I think to do with the second one first. I think the first of the EDO assessments of 2007. In 2013, they moved to a standardized approach, and I might be corrected, but I think the 5 dimensions have continued since then. Some of the methods have been updated, but in the updating process, they've used techniques to enable trend assessment to be retained. On the first question, it's a good one. Romanticizing local engagement, and I think Lars himself actually in his panel comments, made the point that nothing really matters unless it happens on the ground, and that's true. But the point being made here, we can't expect, people on the ground to have the knowledge, experience, information, techniques, have the access to the power, the resources to make the change needed on what's a global phenomenon. And so it has to be a meeting of the top down, it has to be very strong government and international organization led processes, but connected to, the ground. Individuals, have a strong role to play. And I've been toying with the idea recently of the 6 easy sustainability steps that individuals can make. And but communities working together, but we can't kind of the romanticizing idea is that, oh yes, if we all get together in a friendly gathering at the end of the street as a community, we'll be able to solve these global issues. I think it's asking too much, and these groups have an important role to play, but they need the support and the guidance from informed specialists.
Thank you, Nick, for that. It was very, very clear. I think this connection that has to be made. I have another question here. Great presentation, but how could we use the economic approach to reduce the damages by climate change? This could either way in the direction of saying, how do we use numbers to tell decision makers to make smart decisions? That's my take on the question. What do you read out of it?
I think it's the most fundamental question that you can ask about climate change, and we had some conversation in the first day about why the response to climate change globally has been so slow. And in my view, it's so slow because it's a fundamental re-engineering of the economy and almost every aspect of it. And climate change is an exacerbator to the human footprint, which is already exceptionally large and overshooting. So so the challenge is is huge. Like the world responded quite effectively in many places anyway to COVID, and very quickly, and listened to the science in most places, not everywhere. But in climate change, because it's fundamentally changing society and the economy, and people who invested in the economy and got huge personal investments, or companies or organizations are going to resist, and they have resisted, and they've resisted strongly. So it's the economic aspects and the re-engineering of the economy is going to take a lot of time.
All right, I have another comment here in the chat. Nick's point of the need for a nexus approach and the fact that water should be treated not as a sector, but the focal point of intersection of many sectors is very valid. So we got a confirmation from a participant's perspective there, and he will talk about more in the session that's coming up. But still, maybe one question with regards to that. You mentioned that explicitly, the nexus rhetoric. I really like the way you phrased this, because of course science wants to see the whole complexity, and it's important to see the whole complexity. But then we go again, we had this yesterday, back to silos oftentimes, and perhaps governance that's not functioning. What do we do to get the rhetoric in a better shape to really, communicate better?
I think there's a secondary issue here, and again, it was discussed on the first day of how science connects to policy. And I've worked in both spaces. So, policy doesn't like complexity, by and large. Scientists love complexity, though it's very engaging. But the problem with policy and complexity, it's very hard to convey any messages to the people. And we had an interesting example of a minister who was very, very bright in Australia, who put up a spaghetti and meatball complexity diagram, and he soon lost his job. It is an example that that kind of messaging is ineffective. And so policy is what I call a blunt instrument. It tries to shift, the momentum in a certain direction with fairly basic and sometimes brutal, policy innovations, and so because it has many different, audiences, interest to manage across. So, there's a very distinct difference in approaches, and it's not that policymakers don't like, science. Their world is very, very different. If you're in their world and in their heads, they see the world very different to scientists, very different.
Okay, I have one more question. Great and interesting presentation. Can you please give us some thoughts for what can developing countries do to improve water security to prepare for potential increase in COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, well, we've done this analysis of the COVID, and we've identified actions in developing countries which would be most effective, and we're happy to share that. But a lot of the success of some developing countries has been keeping the disease out of the country. So, that's the exposure part of the risk management process. Keep yourself safe by not letting it in. And if it does creep in, clamp down on it very quickly. So a lot of development countries have done exceedingly well. And the Pacific is an example. There's very few cases across the Pacific because they've closed their borders. But once it does get in, these countries are super vulnerable because, they have a lack of resources, of, PPE, access to medical resources, and so on. So the vulnerability is very high. And so the things through the water security sector, of course, are largely around hygiene, having access to clean water, washing facilities, and those kind of things. Another one that we've implemented through AWP is the sewage monitoring, and developing countries don't often have the resources to do vast amounts of individual testing, but you can do a whole village or a whole town or several towns or a region by the sewage COVID monitoring, which will pick up its presence, and very powerful tool in Australia, and I'm sure in Europe too. So there's a couple of ideas anyway that might help there.
Okay, thank you for that. And Shubha Dwivedi is asking a question. Let me know about climate change, whether it is good or bad in your point of view. Last year in India, in the month of February, not experienced too much hot weather, hot temperatures, but this time in February, we're experiencing high temperatures. What do you say to that? And perhaps you could also relate to your own experience in Australia there to underline perhaps some of the facts.
Yeah. We've seen similar things. So 2020 was our hottest year on record with over 1.5 degree, sort of anomaly. This year has been a cool year. We've had a La Nina year, and it's been wet and cool. So that kind of variability, is confusing to people what's really going on here. But the long-term risks of climate change are exceedingly high. And, some what I call the super risks are, around the irreversible tipping points, like, the burning of the forests, the melting of permafrost, so on and so forth. If those tipping points, work together, the paleo climate analysis show you can get a sudden and abrupt change in temperatures without any more emissions, a jump of up to 5 degrees. And we're actually running that risk at the moment. And it's, hard to say to people like, if you've got a 5-degree change, it would wipe out billions of humans. So
yeah,
the risks are high.
Yeah, and the window is closing for us to act on that. I think there is a comment also by Mukand Babel that relates to what you just said. We should understand climate variability and climate change and the differences and the interlinkages, I believe.
Yes, well, we're always subject to climate variability. It's never a static thing. And Australia has, more climate variability, than most continents. Climate change, though, is systematic, and I often prefer to think of it in, the constant global warming of the planet. What we're seeing, there's an interaction between the factors that affect, day-to-day and year-to-year variability, even decadal variability, and climate change. So they are interacting, and often not in, convenient ways. So you can't separate them entirely. They're two different concepts, but they're now progressively interlinking in the way what we finally see as an outcome day to day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe while moving towards the end of our discussion, there's one more comment. Thanks for your bold 6 problem statements, but also the boldly stated ways forward. Yeah, thank you, Loy, for that comment. I think we all agree that was really pointing us to the way forward as well. Let me ask you one question at the end, Nick. I mean, you have seen so many, different projects. You have been part of so many different initiatives, and most importantly, you have had the perspective of different actors, I think, and that is something that is a real treasure, I would say. And perhaps you could share some bits and pieces of that treasure with us, because we have been talking a lot about how do we bring people together from the research side, from the policy making side, decision makers, communities. So what is your take on that? What should we, keep in mind when acting, also on a personal level, perhaps?
Yes, well, firstly, I think I make the point that, there's a lot of good stories out there, it's not all negative. And, I've been part of numerous programs that have had fantastic outcomes. And the best of those have been, what in the day were called partnership programs, where you brought all the key stakeholders together to, identify the problem and then, bring in your technical people to help those people devise solutions. In many cases, the practitioners who are involved in managing the resources or the issue, will come up with 70% of the solutions themselves once they see what needed doing. And then the scientists will come in and add 30%. So there are many good stories. The difficulty is that we're being overwhelmed. Despite those good stories, the negative aspects of climate change and habitat disruption and the human footprint generally is overwhelmingly strong at this point in time. And as you say, time's running out to turn that around. So that's a concern. I should say in my international development experience, a couple of things have delighted me in particular. And that's one, our model of what we call demand-led work, that we work with, our collaborators, governments, organizations in developing countries to help them articulate, what their needs are, to listen to their needs and respond to their needs, not to say, we've got the solution. That is a critical starting point. And probably one of my favorite programs is our young water professional programs, investing in the next generation. And we've got more acclaim, through those programs in countries from governments and ministers and others than any other program, because they can see the importance of the next generation of water leaders. And as part of that, we always encourage, at least 50% gender balance, inclusion of disability and other groups, into those leadership programs. So, that is really transformative.
All right, Nick, thank you very much for this final statement, and thank you very much for being with us here and for a very impressive talk. I think a lot of people, all the people basically, could take away a lot of interesting points for their work. Thanks so much for being with us, and we will see you again briefly later in the wrap-up. We are very happy to have you here and that you're staying on also in the evening hours from Australia. All the best to you, and I see you later, and we all see you later. And thanks to all the contributions, the active participation in the chat. Please stay tuned for the technical sessions, the parallel sessions, and then later on for the wrap-up. See you later.